Hello and welcome back everybody, Dino here from Kite Games. Please allow me to continue our tutorial video series on modding Sudden Strike 4 with a technical interlude. If you tried to start an old mod in the game version 1.06 or later, might have faced the inability to do so, and a subtle hint of a red version number. Behind the delivery of 1.06, there has been a major upgrade in the background technology of Sudden Strike 4, rendering all old mods inoperable in later versions. In order to restore compatibility, a new version of the mod package has been released that is operational with the 2017.3 version of Unity Editor. This video will show you how to transfer your work from the old mod package to the new one, as well as give you a brief technical background on how the modding tool works. This should be useful when troubleshooting any issues in the process of modding Sudden Strike 4. Let us begin by reviewing the file structure of the mod package. Anything outside of Assets folder is incompatible with those in the game or between mod package versions, so you shouldn't bother. The most obvious of your resources are the actual mod level files that reside in the scenes folder, in the mods subfolder, and under a subfolder with your mod's name. Please make sure to back this up before moving to a new version of the mod package. Please note a very important little asset file called UGC metadata in your mods folder. This file holds all the important information about your mod as a Steam Workshop item. Unless you want to upload the new version of your mod to Steam Workshop as a new item, make sure to transfer this file together with the rest of the mod's data to the new mod package. You very well might have assets connected to your mod outside of the mod level, like terrain tiles, unit mods, that you might want to transfer to the new mod package version. Just copy them over to the same subfolder structure you used to have before. To continue, I have loaded the old version of one of the test mods provided with the mod package in new Unity version, please note the version here, with the new mod package, in this case 1.07. Normally your old version of the level should load up perfectly fine in the new mod package. However, for demonstration purposes, this one here has several issues. The first thing I notice is that I'm missing the lush forests I used to have here before. In this case, however, it's not necessarily meaning an error. With the new mod package, we have also included a new conveniency tool that is combining all the visibility options we had before in the editor that were only accessible through complicated menu items. It is called Kite Editor Tools, you can find them in the Windows menu. And we will put it here for conveniency. And as you can see, vegetation is turned off, so let's just turn it on, and it turns out our trees are not gone at all. The visibility options, amongst others, allow you to define how far you want to see vegetation, so you can reduce draw distance should your machine run slow because of too much vegetation to draw. Please note that none of these visibility options affect any object visibility in the editor in play mode or in the actual game. As you can see, there is still a large bold area here regardless of visibility settings. It seems to be an error. A little bit of understanding of the background technology will help us fix that though, in no time. In my first video I already showed where to find asset references to the game's assets, called link objects. Also I showed how they can be placed on the map. What I didn't quite explain is what happens when these references are placed on the map. If you look closely, what you can find on the levels, you will find proxies, different types of them. These are portable representations of actual game entities that know what type of object they are, they store the references to the appropriate assets that are needed, and will make sure to spawn the appropriate object in the editor in runtime and then finally in the game when running the mod. A mod level only stores these proxies and the data contained within them, and not the actual entities they are associated with. It is thanks to these proxies that our mod level has survived an entire version change, and regardless of any of the changes that have gone through in the background, no actual data loss has happened. Based on the data stored within, a proxy is able to generate its associated object upon activation. Activation can be forced by turning the object off and then back on again, effectively fixing most of the entity spawning issues. In certain cases, vegetation objects may need manual regeneration, which can be done either in singular but also in mass. If none of the aforementioned techniques work, reloading the asset databases may be required. It's simplest to achieve it by starting play mode, then exiting it. Please note that the actual reloading of the database only happens on exiting the play mode. Once confirmed that the mod has been fixed, it can be uploaded to Steam Workshop in the usual way. I hope you will find this video useful, and I wish you luck and have fun.
In this episode, we'll be looking at building the environment in a level, which includes the terrain and all the different types of objects that modify the terrain: roads, decals, water surfaces, and vegetation areas.
The terrain is the foundation of your level and defines its basic topology and basic texture. Sudden Strike 4 and its mods use the standard built-in Unity terrain, so if you are familiar how to build and edit Unity terrain and use its tools, then you can safely skip this part of the tutorial. You can access the standard terrain editing tool by selecting terrain and checking out its inspector. Make sure to enable terrain editing, which is usually useful to be turned off in order to prevent accidental selection of the terrain. The standard set of tools for topology editing include raising, lowering, leveling, and smoothing. For each of the tools, you can select an appropriate brush, choose its size and strength. Plus, for some of the tools, you have additional parameters that you can change underneath the brush selection window. To define the base texture of your different areas on the terrain, you can use the standard splat map painting tool, where after selecting the brush and a texture, you can paint different surfaces on the terrain. Under the Edit Textures menu, you can add new textures to your set to paint with, edit existing ones, or remove the ones you don't need anymore. The mod package comes with a set of some sample textures you can use to build your levels, but feel free to add your own ones. Once we are satisfied with the basic topology and texturing of our terrain, it is time to fill it with detail. The simplest detail objects you can place on a terrain, though usually coming as a last step of decoration, are decals. To create a decal, create a decal proxy and configure it. First of all, you need to provide the texture the decal will be based off. You can either reference the decal in the game through a link object, or provide one of your own materials if you want to. Proxies use the same sets of attributes than the objects associated with them, though not all of the properties make sense in the context of modding. In further discussions, irrelevant attributes will be skipped. Let us have a quick overview of the properties of decals. Before discussing in detail, let us set a few default parameters to make the decal appear. To control the visibility of multiple overlapping decals, you can use the layer slider to move one of the decals above the other. Please note that there is only a limited number of layers you can use. Should you have trouble with terrain poking through your decal, you can always give it a little bit of bias. To resize your decal, you can change the scale or texture scale parameters, with both of them having the same effect, but together having a multiplied one. As a final touch, you can use the opacity slider to define how strongly your decal will stand out of the background. The following objects we are about to discuss have a common trait. That's they are composites. That means that they are defined by a shape and the object itself. Technically speaking, a decal is a composite, but it's the simplest one because its shape is a single node. Alas, the more complex ones are defined by a line or an area. Both lines and areas are defined by a subsequent set of nodes. The only difference is that areas create a loop between the last and the first node. When working with composites, it is advisable to configure their visibility options according to the objects you are about to work with. First, let us look at roads in more detail. You can place roads on the map in a similar way you would do with decals. Create a game object, and add a road proxy component to it. You instantly get the option to add nodes to it, and you have the option to insert nodes between existing ones once you have nodes. Alternatively, you can use Control-click to insert new nodes. Keep in mind that you can always adjust the visibility options to your current editing needs. Displaying the spine, for example, can be very helpful, while your node has no textures. Now that we are satisfied with the trail of our road, let's look at its attributes. The first thing you will find for a road is that you need to provide a material, very much like for a decal. You can either use a material link you already have among the standard assets, or you can provide your own material. For all composite objects, you will find shape properties and properties that are connected to the object itself. Again, in a very similar way to decals, you can define how your road follows terrain. The difference is there are two free modes. In planar mode, all your road nodes will be in a single plane. Full free mode will allow you to change the height for each and every separate node. The resolution attribute is the distance at which the tessellation nodes are generated from the spline for the spine of the road. It also defines the resolution of the source geometry. Please note that if your road is aligned to the terrain, a special terrain-aligned geometry is generated based on the source geometry. In this case, the resolution only controls the source geometry's resolution and not the final one, which is defined by the terrain resolution. In case of free terrain, the resolution is the resolution of the final geometry. The fading of the edges of the road can be controlled on a per node basis. The detail smooth parameter controls over what percentage of the half width of the road the fading happens through. Set this to 1 and it will start fading in right at the edge of the road. Setting this to 0 will leave no fading at all. You usually want to use an intermediate value. With the layer attribute, you can control overlapping, similarly to and in conjunction with decals. The width attribute plainly controls the width of our road. The offset attribute allows you to align your road on either side of the source spline. Please note that this attribute does not work in follow terrain mode. Should you have trouble with the terrain calling your road geometry, you can always use the bias attribute to offset it vertically, similarly to that of decals. As already noted, there are several things you can configure on a per node basis. For this, select a node you want to configure, where you can offset the road around that node, define the fading of the edges from both sides, as well as change the road's relative width around that node, making it wider or narrower. Please note that offsetting only works with free mode roads. So far we were only concerned with visuals, but on the long run we want to create a gameplay area, and different terrain types are an integral part of that. You can configure a road to not override any surface areas underneath it, or use any of the two provided road types. A solid road is something you would set up for a concrete or asphalt, and dirt road for a usual dirt road. Both of these special road surface types have their own effects on the units moving on them. We have already covered different surface types in detail in the very first tutorial video, and we'll also come back to them in some detail further on in this one. Because the primary way of defining terrain types is surface areas, it is very important to define the relation between the road's surface types and different surface areas. If we want the road to override surface areas it is overlapping, then tick the drawn areas. If you want the surface areas overlapping the road to override its surface, then untick it. Lastly, the system will have to detect where exactly the road's surface type needs to be applied to the terrain. It can either use the road's geometry purely, or, to take different fadings into account, tick the use alpha. Please note that there is no blending between surface types, so a cut will happen at 50% opacity. Rivers are very much like roads, just even simpler. They have a proxy with a shape inside that can be edited in the very same way as you would do with roads. In order for the river to appear, you need to define its material from either one of the materials provided with a modding package, or you can supply your own one. The rest of the attributes are very much the same the road has, with the same name. Please note that the river can always be only planar, and it does not offer the option to change that. If you need still water, you can use a lake proxy to place it. These weird terrain formations are for demonstration purposes. Once it has a material assigned, it is ready to be used. Unlike rivers though, lakes define their boundaries automatically based on terrain. For that, terrain height map needs to be regenerated, together with the rest of the surfaces. If anything has been modified around the lake, you can force fill the water with the fill button. Filling is constrained inside an area defined by the values max width, max height, around the center of the lake. If the lake is set to stop at terrain, it will fill only the cavity it is put into. If set to call terrain, it will fill all nearby cavities that fall into the maximum area, but will be called by terrain. If set to ignore terrain, the entire area will be filled with water. The last two composites we will be dealing in this video are grasses and forests. They are both usually defined by areas,
though please note that you can plant trees along spines too. The very first modding tutorial video has already introduced surface areas to define different terrain types. Now they also be used to define vegetation areas. Unlike in case of roads, you need to explicitly add a surface area. Note, not a proxy in this case. Then you can define whether to attach grass or forest to it. Surface areas are edited in a very similar way as roads are. They are defined by nodes. And the only thing you need to take care is the winding order, in order not to turn your area inside out. For surface area, we can define its terrain type, some basic geometry configuration, and there is a tick here saying call vegetation. Let's stop right there for a minute. Areas can overlap each other, and overlapping is defined by their order in the hierarchy. The lower something is in order, the higher it will be in overlapping order. You can always double check your overlappings, turning on solid area colors. You can easily change your overlapping orders by reorganizing your layers in the hierarchy. Back to the original question. A surface area that has call vegetation defined will call vegetation of any area it overlaps, which can be easily used to create clearings inside a forest. Now let's start adding plants to the scene. There are two different types of vegetation you can add to a surface area, tree or grass, and they are very different in their usage. Grass is useful when you want to add an area with a large number of relatively uniform plant models. The implementation of grass will make sure that it doesn't display a repeating pattern even over large areas, despite of the small variation of actual plant models. However, to achieve that, it uses relatively complex grass patch assets, which are not available for manual configuration from the modding tool, but you are free to use any of the predefined grass patch assets. You can repopulate your grass after any modification to, for example, the area itself, by pushing the generate button. Forests are the complete opposite to what has just been said. They allow for a lot of customization, but care needs to be taken to prevent the formation of any irregularities. Of course, if the goal is to have regular patterns, it is achievable also. Let us start by creating a forest proxy. The very first thing we will need to define is a set of models that will be used to populate the vegetation area, because multiple models can be used to populate the forest. That alone can allow for a lot of variation. In this case, two separate tree models will be used. One can configure what percentage of the appearing plants should be from each of the models. Each model allows separately to define at what average scale ratio they should appear at. Don't leave that at 0. The first time you put a forest on a level, most probably you will have to press generate. The rest of the attributes are all about the positioning of the individual tree models. The very first step is to define what the grid type will be that will give the basis of the planting. Square grid is better suited for artificial planting, for example orchards, while triangle is better suited for natural formations like forests. The alignment of a square grid can be rotated ± 45 degrees. Please note that a 90-degree rotation can be easily achieved by swapping the row and column values. Row distance defines how far the rows of plants are from each other. In case of a triangle grid, it is the uniform distance between the plants. In case of a square grid, you can define the column distance using the plant distance attribute. This attribute does not exist for triangle grids. By default, plant models are placed on the terrain with their pivot points aligned to it. Should you need, you could define an offset from the terrain in a uniform way for your plant. The rest of the attributes are all about keeping or breaking the pattern defined by the grid. Random displacement will move the plants from the grid points in a random direction to a random distance between the minimum and its maximum values. Some care needs to be taken though. Too high values of displacement compared to base plant distance can cause clusters of plants to form. A base angle can be defined for the plant models from which each will start, and a range in which they will get a random rotation in degrees. The last two attributes define the range of the random scale factor applied to the base scale that will be used to scale the individual instances of the plants. In the end, a lot of the work done here will come down to gameplay. After regenerating terrain, all the surface areas, the roads, the water surfaces, will define different terrain types that will affect gameplay. It is useful to know how the scanning happens to understand the final result. First, all the areas and roads are scanned. Overlapping between a road and the areas is defined by the road's property drawn areas. Overlapping between areas is defined by their order in the hierarchy. Water surfaces are scanned based on a much more rigid rule set. Waters deeper than 1 meter will become riverbeds, and no unit can pass through them. Shallower water, however, will become fords, and units can freely pass through. Manually placing a surface area over water surface allows for a limited degree of change in rules. A surface area may define explicitly a ford, deep water, or any of the swamp variations. And that, dear ladies and gentlemen, concludes today's modding tutorial on Sudden Strike 4.